I think we'll make a start. Welcome everyone to the Blue Anthropocene in Latin American seminar series. My name's Sarah Gibbon. I'm based at UCL in the anthropology and one of the teams collaborating on the embodied inequalities of the Anthropocene project, along with other colleagues at UCL and also collaborators in CIESAS in Mexico and the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. So we're really delighted, along with UCL Anthropocene, to be hosting this seminar series that has been organised by a colleague here at UCL, Rebecca Irons. And just before handing over to Rebecca to introduce the series and our first speaker this year, and by way of background, a little bit about the embodied inequalities of the Anthropocene project. So this initiative brings together environmental, indigenous, biosocial, multi-species, gender and theoretical expertise in medical anthropology and associated disciplines to examine how the Anthropocene impacts human health. So over the last 2 years, we've been collectively involved in producing podcasts, seminar series, films and publications, fostering exchanges and developing learning capacity between different disciplinary traditions and knowledges. And we are delighted to say that one of the key products of our collaboration is our open access multilingual teaching tool that's currently being launched across the 3 national contexts of our collaboration, with the UCL launch date set for the 16th of November. And we'll include an invite for that event in the chat here. So we're really delighted to be continuing our seminar series this year with this centrally important focus on water, oceans and rivers to examine the vital role that they play in Anthropocene health. So just one final word before I hand over to Rebecca to say that you can access this seminar, which will be presented in English, through the translated closed captions function on your Zoom screen if you want to read the transcript in a different language, and instructions for that will also follow in the chat. So I'll hand over to Rebecca now.
Thank you, Sarah. And just an apologies in advance to everyone for the unavoidable background noise. I hope it doesn't interfere too much with the presentation that I'm about to say now. So as Sarah noted, this seminar series is going to bring together leading scholarship representing diverse geographical and social contexts of Latin America, with a focus on human-ocean relationships and how these support or disrupt the current state of blue Anthropocene crisis on which we find ourselves. So opening this seminar series, today we're joined by Maximilian Viatori for his presentation on the current inequalities and movements and meanings of ocean waste in Peru. Now, Max is professor and head of the Department of Anthropology at the Royal University of Newfoundland. Max has conducted ethnographic and archival research on inequality, neoliberalism and political ecology in Ecuador, Canada and Peru since 2001. He is the author of One State, Many Nations, Indigenous Rights Struggles in Ecuador, which was published by the School for Advanced Research Press in 2010, and lead author of Coastal Lives, Nature, Capital and the Struggle for Artisanal Fisheries in Peru, published by the University of Arizona Press in 2019. His newest book, The Unequal Ocean, Living with Environmental Change Along the Peruvian Coast, was published by the University of Arizona Press in April 2023. So welcome, Max. Thanks so much for joining us today. Really looking forward to your presentation, and I'll hand over to you now.
Well, hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. I just want to start off by thanking Dr. Rebecca Irons for the invitation to share some of my research with you. I'm so excited about the work that's happening at UCL on the blue Anthropocene and embodied inequalities of the Anthropocene as well. This is, fascinating and I think really critical work. So, I hope that I can connect to the work that I've been doing with some of those themes and talk a little bit about why I think Peru is such a really critical and fascinating and important place for thinking through some of the big questions that I think we're confronting when we talk about issues and concepts like the blue Anthropocene and the inequalities that are such a central aspect of that. So let me start off here. I don't know if we can start the slides. There we go. All right, excellent. Thank you so much. So the title of my talk today is Current Inequalities, Movements and Meanings of Ocean Waste in Peru. And in this talk today, I'm going to link together some of the different aspects of inequality that I've been working on and studying in coastal Peru, particularly in Lima, although I've been working in a few other areas close by, and the way that those different aspects of ocean movements, and particularly today, I'll spend some time talking about ocean waste, how those link different people together in unequal and at times unexpected ways. So if we go to the second slide, please. In this talk, I'm going to present a small portion of my most recent book, The Unequal Ocean, which explores how prevailing representations of the ocean obscure racialized disparities and the ways that different people experience the impacts of the climate crisis. So in the book, I've been interested in looking at different aspects of how people are dealing with and living with environmental change through things like coastal development and recreation around issues like surfing and the ocean infrastructure that is such a critical aspect of Lima's urbanization, as well as pollution and the circulation of ocean garbage, the production of global commodities. I have a long-term interest in, and I've been working since about 2012 on issues related to fisheries and the different aspects of dispossession and displacement that have occurred and continue to occur in Peru around fishing and fisheries. Today, in focusing on ocean waste, I'm going to try to combine a few of those different things together and think about how ocean waste circulates off the coast of Lima, Peru, and what happens when it stops. When plastic trash, for example, or other kinds of waste shows up on the beach, or an infestation of worms is found in the sand, or when government water testing locates coliform bacteria in the water where people swim or fish. So I'm interested today in kind of exploring a little bit about how waste circulates and what happens when it stops. What kinds of meanings become attached to it, and thinking about those moments of circulation and then stopping as being critical ways in which people infuse things like bacteria or garbage or plastic trash with very specific social meanings that are critical for thinking about how environmental issues simultaneously are issues of social inequality and social justice in Peru. So if we go to the second slide, please. As I said, the area where I've been working for over 10 years now has primarily been in Lima, which is Peru's capital city, and it's home to roughly a third of Peru's national population. It's the only national capital located directly on South America's Pacific coast. And the city has changed considerably in recent decades. And as a result of those changes, its coastline has also changed and been the subject of significant modifications and alterations, as well as these ongoing debates and concerns about its use, about its form, and about pollution. So it's a really fascinating place for exploring some of these issues. And I don't have a lot of time to kind of go into this. And there's some, excellent anthropological as well as sociological and work in political science about changes in Lima and this ongoing process of urbanization. But to just kind of summarize that, we can say kind of over the past 50 or so years, Lima's population has grown by a multiple of somewhere around 5 or 6, as impoverished, often indigenous migrants from the Andean highlands have moved to the city to escape civil war and economic crisis. So there's been this ongoing transformation really of demographic transformation of Peru in general and Lima in particular. And this is really critical for thinking about the ways in which different places and different groups of people are racialized and classed and also gendered and the way that that continues to shift. As the anthropologist Daniela Gandolfo makes clear in her wonderful ethnography of urban renewal in Lima, the city's cultural, political, and economic elites have viewed this migration, this ongoing rural to urban migration, as a quote unquote invasion. And Daniela Gandolfo and people like Shane Green, who's also whose work on punk in Lima explores in wonderful detail the ways in which elite geographies of the city have changed, and the ways in which as a result of this kind of movement of the rural countryside into the city, people have reworked ideas about race, racialization, particularly around indigeneity, and also class, in order to kind of set up these contrasts essentially between white elite urban culture and this influx of indigenous rural, oftentimes, there's an association or contrast between Spanish and Quechua speaking culture as well. And the coastline has changed amidst that also. In the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, the coastal districts in Lima were, primarily these summer residences, resorts, and beginning in the mid 20th century, there was this increased shift that really increased pretty rapidly during the 1980s, in which increasingly wealthy people abandoned the center of the city and moved towards the coastline. And there's all this kind of language about people escaping the asphyxiation of the central part of the city and moving to the ocean, and moving towards the oxygen. And much of this was this movement away from rural migrants, indigenous migrants, impoverished people. And so the coastline changed as a result of this as well. And there's a whole built infrastructure that emerged beginning in about the 1970s. There was an expressway that was built along the bottom of the sand cliffs, that characterize Lima's coastline, to kind of provide people with an easier way to connect the different coastal residential areas. And this also became this place of recreation, of parks, of human expanded beaches. There were very wealthy beach resorts like the Club Waikiki, which is this kind of surfing enclave that that is still there. That's still a kind of interesting landmark in the coastal part of the city. And so a lot of the work that I've been doing over the past decade, and that I'll talk about today, is about that transformation and those ongoing transformations and the way that people read different aspects of the coastal environment, nature, the infrastructure, through this particular racialized, class, social lens. We go to the next slide, please. So the focus for a lot of the work that I've been doing, and the area that I'll be talking about the most today, is Lima's Central Coast, which is referred to as the Costa Verde. This translates literally to anyone who's not a Spanish speaker as the Green Coast, because Lima is a coastal desert, but it gets lots and lots of fog every day, and that moisture historically has fed these kinds of hanging plants and vines that are located along those cliffs, which makes them green during a lot of the year. You can see that a little bit from that first picture. So once a sanctuary for elite recreation, Lima's Central Coast has become a site for popular recreation, transportation. It's also a workplace for people working in the tourism industry, and significantly also for quite a large local artisanal fishery that provides a lot of food fish for Lima's population. And it's also become a free sink for dumping the city's growing sewage and construction waste. In recent decades, Lima's seawater and beaches have become objects of an elite gaze, in which the facts of ocean or beach waste invoke a whole set of material and semantic relationships that reinforce a link between environmental contamination and its perceived social marginalization which also enables a host of government interventions and public sharing. So this is kind of ongoing debate. This is ongoing concern about what's happening with the Costa Verde, this area that was, developed, in the 1970s, the 1980s, as being this kind of elite escape from urbanization, has, then during the 1980s, during the 1990s, also became the site of ongoing contamination. During the 70s and 80s, there were multiple sewage collectors that dotted the beach. And, during this period of increased rural to urban migration during the 1980s, as a result of, the Civil War in Peru, there were growing numbers of people moving to the city, this increased informal street economy, this growing sewage output in the city as a result of, the booming population. And also, these beaches were public beaches that were one of the few sites of, possible recreation for, the city's poor population. So this has been this ongoing tension over recent decades. There's really increased over the last 10 years or so, with growing concern around ocean waste and ocean pollution, about what the Costa Verde is, how contaminated it is, who's responsible for this contamination, and what should be done about that. And within those debates and discussions, there are all these, these discourses about social contamination and filth and waste that are being marshaled to frame these debates in a way that invokes these historic processes of racialization and these kinds of ongoing social tensions in Peru. So if we go to the next slide, please. Lima has been infamous, famous. I'm not quite sure how you want to frame that. Probably depends on how you see it, as having consistently now quite a few years of having the most contaminated beach in South America. This is Playa Carpio, which is in Callao, which is the port city. It's the largest port in Peru. It is a really significant port for the movement of natural resources, for shipping, also fishing. It's located just north of the center of Lima. Waste that circulates in Lima's waters and is deposited on its beaches links and crosses multiple social assemblages at once. And I would argue that in kind of thinking about this linking, that dominant readings of ocean waste strip away and obscure relationships of care and responsibility in ways that reproduce enduring social inequalities, so that it can seem as though, quotes, out of place waste is a result of people who are supposedly, quotes, out of place in Lima. This is a dynamic that transcends current concerns with plastic ocean waste. And I think it's really critical for thinking about how plastic waste in particular has become infused with particular social and cultural meanings in Lima. So, as I've said, there's this long history in Lima of elite anxiety about the composition of the city's seawater. And local elites have long made dubious links between the area's environmental and supposedly social contamination. Another really interesting example of this, that we wrote about in the second book was the cholera outbreak that occurred in this area during the 1990s, and the ways in which focus on that was really on the kind of social, quote unquote, filth and contamination that was occurring along the coastline and in central Lima as a result of this influx of urban migrants. And this is something that had reverberations throughout the artisanal fishing community in ways that further racialized artisanal fishers as well. This dynamic, that tension has become heightened in recent years, with increased attention being paid both in Peru and abroad around the amount of trash in Lima's waters and beaches, exemplified here by repeated declarations of Playa Carpio in Callao as South America's dirtiest beach. So if we could go to the next slide, please. waste is really kind of an interesting thing in that it's something that circulates in the ocean in both predictable ways and also unexpected ways that result in the movement of items like plastic trash across large distances, and then their accumulation and concentration in particular ocean spaces. Joshua Reno, who's an anthropologist who's done a lot of really critical work on waste, argues that waste management is essential in that it makes waste invisible by moving it elsewhere. But he also notes that waste can circulate and bite back as a result of non-human flows and divides. And of course, oceans or the global ocean, remains outside the control of human systems. Currents circulate ocean waste in ways that are not dictated by, and it often, as I'll kind of explore a little bit today, undermine human management systems. Kind of interesting example of this is in 2018, a patch of garbage the size of Mexico was discovered in the South Pacific Ocean off the coast of Chile and Peru. And while it contained a lot of trash, from Chile and Peru, it also contained debris from as far away as New Zealand. And this was something that largely existed out of sight. This is a way in which, by dumping things into rivers and oceans, that they were kind of hidden away until, the scientific expedition and ensuing media coverage made it clear that there was this massive, floating island of garbage, which is, this kind of ongoing global concern, and there's been rightfully so increased attention being paid to this in the past decade, 2 decades. The growing abundance of plastic debris and sewage bacteria that were supposed to remain invisible and stay elsewhere have increasingly accumulated in overwhelming quantities in the wrong, or the quote unquote wrong places, such as the beaches of the Costa Verde. And some really important context for this is that, as I said, Lima has undergone this rapid urbanization in recent decades, quintupling, sextupling, its population, depending on exactly how you measure that. Just to put that in perspective, in 1960, there were less than 2 million people in Lima. There are now around, if not a little bit over 11 million people. And the kind of most important sewage collector built in Lima, in La Chira, which is just south of the Costa Verde, was built in the 1960s. Right now, there are only 4 official landfills in the city, and these dumps can take only a fraction of the total waste produced each day by the city's residents. Much of the beach waste in Lima comes from garbage that is dumped into the Rimac, the Chillon, and the Lorin rivers. And additionally, millions of gallons of mostly untreated or undertreated sewage are dumped by the city's sewage collectors, which are constantly behind capacity and unable to keep up with the city's population, into Lima's waters each day at places like La Chira. And you can see from the portions of the maps, that I put up on the slide here, prevailing currents generally, most of the year flow from roughly south to north along the coast. So they push up along the coast. So, the sewage collector, at La Chira dumps a bunch of, waste into the ocean. And, they've recently extended this pipe out so that it kind of dumps it out a little bit farther out into the ocean. But for the most part, this gets kind of pushed up along Lima's coast. And then, the kind of directions of the waves change a little bit. For the most part, though, those waves then are kind of pushing in towards the coast and then kind of pushing that waste in along the coast, particularly during the winter. During the summer months, when there's more kind of, flow from the rivers, there's a little bit more of a kind of flow of waste that goes out into the ocean. But, during the winter months, a lot of that waste is getting pushed back up right along the Costa Verde. And then there's this eddy effect that occurs down at the base of the bay there, which concentrates a bunch of that waste in this kind of slowly swirling water right in the area where you have, this significant, historically significant, economically, socially significant artisanal fishing dock in Chorrillos, but then also where you have the most popular and kind of most heavily used beaches for recreation for the quote unquote popular classes, beaches like Playa Agua Dulce, Las Sombrillas, because these are also the beaches where the sand tends to accumulate naturally, and also, human deposited sand tends to stay because, you have this kind of slowly circulating current, and, it's not kind of, tearing that kind of sand away as it does on many of the other beaches in Chorrillos, or in Lima. So you've got this really interesting dynamic along the southern portion of that coastline, where the most contaminated waters, the most, kind of contaminated beaches are also the most heavily used for social, recreational, economic reasons, particularly by, poor people in Lima. And so this area in particular has become this focus of elite concern and gaze, which is something that I'm going to, turn to and examine now. If we go to the next slide, please. So you can see, here along the Costa Verde, we've got a picture on the left, or on my left. You can see in between those two lanes, this is, the expressway that was built through the expansion of, the beaches, through the expansion of, the lower shelf of the Costa Verde, to increase traffic flow. And in this area, it goes around the historic Club Waikiki. This is this historic, very elite, very kind of, white male, space that was created in the 1940s in Lima for surfing. And you can see there then on the map on the side, where the fishing wharf is. You can see where La Chira is, on the kind of southern portion of that. And that's, depositing waste out into the ocean, which then flows up past the fishing wharf, the Playa Agua Dulce, and then also along the Costa Verde, where you have some of the most socially and economically exclusive districts of Lima, Miraflores, and San Isidro in particular. So, you've got this intricate system of currents that circulates this waste in the waters off Lima's coast, dispersing it in some areas and concentrating it in others. So if we go to the next slide, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about plastic. Plastic waste, of course, and rightfully so, has become a huge issue in thinking about contamination, about the ways in which oceans are being altered in the Anthropocene. And the circulation of, at the same time, the circulation of plastic waste, I think it's really important to put it in context in Lima and think about the ways in which this kind of global issue and the global language is being used to talk about waste becomes subtly infused with these kinds of racialized and class meanings in Peru through efforts aimed at cleaning up beaches, or kind of talking and thinking about the circulation, and then those moments when plastic waste stops on the beach, as this picture is from Chorrillos, from the Playa Agua Dulce. The circulation of plastic waste, I would argue, exceeds important aspects of cultural politics and power in Peru, while it also reinforces significant components of existing inequalities. The ubiquity of ocean plastic in all its forms surpasses state control, as well as human efforts to clean it up. Efforts to address plastic pollution in Peru, as throughout much of the world right now, have focused primarily on cleaning up visible plastic trash on beaches and encouraging consumers to avoid single-use plastics like grocery bags and straws. And while such campaigns are significant, they're important, they've raised awareness about plastic waste and pressured the Peruvian state to act on the issue, they also tend to reinforce, in oftentimes subtle ways, longstanding beliefs about, what Daniela Gandolfo refers to as filth in class in Lima, as well as obscure, oftentimes the structural inequalities that limit different consumers' ability to make choices about the plastic that they use. If we go to the next slide, please. So in Peru, NGOs, many of which are run by people with considerable social capital, have driven awareness and action on ocean plastic waste. Local environmental activists have taken it upon themselves to coordinate with transnational environmental NGOs, to coordinate beach cleanups and awareness campaigns, and pressure local and national governments. One of the important results of this was that in 2018, the Peruvian state passed a new law to regulate and phase out certain single-use plastics over a 3-year period. Of course, one of the difficulties of that, and this is an ongoing issue in Peru as it is in other places, in that, in Peru, there are many laws on the books that then are still awaiting a regulatory norm to be able to be enacted. And so, there was this quite expansive law in 2018 that was passed to phase out single-use plastics, but only one portion of it has actually been has been instituted through a regulatory norm. So there's this, this is a kind of impartial success, but it is a success nonetheless. And the success of anti-plastic campaigns, I think, is worth noting in a country where the state has a long history of violent opposition to environmental activism. I would argue that this success is due in large part to how anti-plastic campaigns have dovetailed with existing race class geographies of coastal Lima and ongoing concerns with the contamination of those spaces. These campaigns have largely, when you kind of drill down into them, examine the kind of language around them in particular, largely reproduce the idea of the ocean and the coast as this natural refuge. That is something that is kind of featured and is central within elite topographies, where the ocean over the past 50 years in the history, in kind of Lima's history of urbanization, has been seen as something that is, provides well-to-do residents with, the kind of oxygen that they need from the quote unquote asphyxiation. And these are language, this is language that was used by one of the architects who was also then a mayor of Miraflores in the 1970s, who was pivotal in leading the kind of development expansion of the coast. This mass of rural, indigenous, and poor migrants. The other thing too to keep in mind here is that plastic bags, plastic forks, straws, plates are part and parcel of Lima's informal street vendor economy. Depending on which numbers you look at, the majority, whether it's 60, 70, 80% of Lima's population is employed in, the quote unquote informal economy, which the informality also has its own kind of racialized connotation in Lima, which I probably don't have time to get into here. And like the sewage that teems through the area's waters are yet another indication for local elites that their spaces of recreation have been despoiled by migrants who do not, quotes, belong in the city. Commenting on plastic waste on Lima's beaches in a newspaper article, Arturo Alfaro, who's the president of VIDA, one of the NGOs that has been a leader in anti-plastic campaigns, recently noted that various forms of plastic, quotes, end up in the ocean because of poor management of solid waste and a lack of awareness and citizen environmental education, unquote. While Peru's new law includes rolling restrictions on the production of certain kinds of plastic, media coverage of the law has stressed its importance for changing, quotes, Peruvians' chip regarding the excessive use of non-reusable bags, unquote. And Martín Vizcarra, who was Peru's president at the time that the law was passed, asserted that the passage of the law would, quotes, change the comportment of our society to be friendlier to the environment, and argued that, quotes, we need to change the mentality of Peruvians. So these awareness campaigns kind of take the same focus of encouraging individual Peruvians to make better choices and recycle single-use plastics instead of throwing them away to, in the words of another anti-plastic NGO's website, quotes, care for the oceans. However, there has been only a very limited recycling capacity in Lima, much less in the rest of Peru. And only a certain number of plastics can be recycled in Lima, and only in certain primarily wealthy coastal municipalities. Only a small portion of Lima's, and again, mostly, kind of white elite residents can participate in the environmental citizenship that anti-plastic campaigns have promoted, which are based on caring for the ocean by taking individual responsibility to make, quotes, good personal choices. We can go to the next slide, please. Plastic waste has emerged within global environmental discourse as, one of the most pressing environmental issues facing the world's oceans. In contrast, the circulation of sewage and garbage don't have the same kind of global resonance. And many of Lima's residents see the contamination that emanates from them, from sewage, for example, as a more local issue, one that clearly signifies issues in the city's social constitution and its geography, to a greater degree than plastic waste. Oceanic contamination, especially from sewage, carries with it a significantly greater perception of social filth, of bodily waste that should be distanced from people and made invisible as quickly as possible. For elites, the ongoing presence of sewage in Lima's waters is an indication of ongoing social ills: government ineptitude, influx of race, class, others, quotes, deficiency of culture, lack of education. And I should note too that this is an ongoing, and I think a really kind of critical and interesting issue in most coastal cities. I think for the most part, if you go swimming in beaches that are located in a coastal city, whether it's Vancouver or Los Angeles or wherever, you're most likely coming into contact with some form of sewage and coliform bacteria. Within elite topographies of Lima's Costa Verde, nowhere is this more apparent than the Playa Pescadores, the fisherman's beach, where I've done a lot of my research, and the Playa Agua Dulce, which is located right next to that. It's the freshwater beach because there are, historically these freshwater springs, that emerge in different parts of, the Costa Verde. They're fewer than there used to be as the water table of the city continues to drop. These beaches are on the one hand derided by the city's elites for being dirty, polluted, and yet at the same time are the most popular beaches for beachgoers from the poor districts of the city. The beaches in Chorrillos, excuse me, are often on the list of waters that are listed as unfit for swimming because of high bacteria levels and waste on the beaches. You can see that the red flag in the picture here. These flags are placed by the health ministry, particularly during the summer, during the kind of months for beach recreation along the city's beaches, to warn people of the beaches where the water is kind of not safe for recreation. This represents a significant example of how impoverished people are often exposed to greater environmental harm and toxicity, even in recreational activities. Government watering testing momentarily stops the circulation of this waste, of sewage waste, and makes it visible in the form of a narrow range of test results, primarily for coliform bacteria, which is used as a proxy of overall water quality. And this process fixes the circulation of waste in a specific place, in a particular moment in time, closely associating specific beaches with the filth of sewage while absolving others. So, in addition to the flags, every week in the papers, on the TV news, there's also usually a list of, different beaches that are apt for swimming or are unfit for swimming. If we go to the next slide, please. In February 2018, the height of the summer beach going season, one of the local TV stations, TV Peru, broadcast a story about worms on Playa Pescadores with the images of small white wriggling critters in the sand. The General Directorate of Environmental Health and Food Safety momentarily declared the beach unfit for swimming. The next day, however, the next day, the agency's lab director reported non-findings. The worms weren't present. They couldn't confirm what they were, or if they'd even been a safety risk. Nonetheless, this story continued to run, and this is emblematic, right? This is an example that is emblematic of, this kind of ongoing dynamic, this thing that, I think you see repeatedly if you're paying attention to media coverage of the beaches and this kind of example of this elite gaze. The story continued to run on local media. That night on a local talk show called La Noche es Mía, there was this sensationalized expose called, quotes, "They wash clothes in Agua Dulce," with the subtitle of, quotes, "The last straw, they don't just leave trash, now they wash clothes." The segment was introduced by the show's two hosts, a man and a woman sitting in a television studio who bantered about going to the beach. The man asked his co-host where she liked to go to the beach, to which she replied, Punta Hermosa, which is a beach community south of Lima that's popular among the city's elites, right? As the kind of Costa Verde, as the Central Coast has become, increasingly popularized and despoiled, wealthy in the city who have the means have moved out of the city to find, more pristine areas for beach homes, and summer recreation. In response, he laughed and called her a pituca, which is it means snob in Lima slang, but it also carries very specific race class connotations. After some back and forth, he said to her, barely containing his laughter, quotes, "You should go to Agua Dulce, where there are worms in the sea." And then he said, in Agua Dulce, they're washing clothes, and the sea, how is it doing? The broadcast then jumped to footage of two women wading in a freshwater pool with clothes around them drying on the rocks and a shirtless man standing near a truck. The reporter approached them and asked accusingly what they were doing. The man replied several times that they were just taking water from the spring because they did not have any in their house in San Juan de Lurigancho, the most populous district of Lima, and one, with pretty extensive poverty. And within elite imagined geographies of the city, the district is often associated with crime and symbolizes the problems of the city's rapid expansion. As the camera focused on the man, viewers could hear the reporter's voice saying things such as, quotes, "Who does this beach belong to, mister?" And quotes, "You're invading the beach." Again, invoking this language of, this kind of rural to urban migration as a, quotes, invasion. The reporter later stated, with dramatic music playing in the background and images of laundry brushes and soaking clothes, that they captured images of people washing clothes on the beach because they'd been alerted by local bathers who were indignant that part of this, quotes, beach of the people had been taken by these, quotes, planet aggressors who were contaminating the water with their detergent and soap. The reporter engaged in repeated acts of public shaming, at one point grabbing one of the empty packets of laundry soap the women were using and holding it up to the camera while saying, quotes, "This is what is contaminating our beaches." At the end of the segment, when the view cut back to the studio and the male host, all he said was, quotes, "My poor little country." And of course, this is totally absurd, right? What is contaminating the beaches are not, individual packets of soap or individual people washing their clothes, but the untreated sewage from 11 million people. And yet, through this particular gaze, this particular way of framing contamination, it's something that is increasingly and repeatedly blamed upon, poor, racialized, residents of the city in a way that, absolves, elites and government officials of responsibility for this, this structural issue and problem. We go to the next slide, please. So one of the other issues, that I see in this and that I documented throughout my work is not only that there is this kind of ongoing framing of issues of contamination in a way that blames people who are, blames impoverished, racialized people for it, but it also does this in a way in which it consistently overlooks the different forms, not only of harm that people suffer as a result of, having, to work in these contaminated environments on a daily basis, of having, these contaminated environments as being their only, sites for recreation. But it also overlooks the profound knowledge that people have of these environments, people who are interacting with these environments on a daily basis and working or recreating in them, and the different forms of care that people engage with. Particularly, this is something that I see, or repeatedly documented, with the fishers who I've been working with and studying in Lima. And so I want to spend a little bit of time now talking about the different ways in which, and the different kinds of quite profound knowledge that these artisanal fishers have of this contaminated environment, of the knowledge that they need in order to navigate this and make a living in this environment, but also the different ways in which they engage in care for this environment, which are evacuated from kind of broader elite government media depictions not only of this environment, but the people who are spending a lot of time in it. In September 2019, I visited fishing friends at the Playa Agua Dulce, and it struck me how, quotes, clean the beach was. It wasn't covered in the usual seaweed and trash, but looked sandy, like the other surrounding beaches. My friend Luis and I exchanged greetings and hugs, and we quickly got caught up talking about all that had happened in the past year. I asked Luis what he was up to, and he gestured to his wheelbarrow, which was full of garbage, most of it plastic. And he said that the local fishing association had been working on, cleaning up the beach, and that these efforts were motivated in part by government pressure. And there's been this ongoing government pressure on the local fishing association to, clean up the beach, clean up, the wharf area, for various reasons. Been a lot of, this kind of focus on this area in particular as being an area that's problematic for, hygiene, which also has this very, kind of racialized history in Lima and more broadly in Peru. But these efforts were also motivated in part by fishers' desire to see if they could attract more tourists who might then spend money on the dock on fish, on boat rides, on food. Luis finished his cigarette and gathered his rake. And then he asked the other fisher who was with him to push the wheelbarrow back to the shed where it was stored. As we walked back to the dock together, he commented on how much better he thought the beach looked, but also lamented the fact that there was a constant stream of garbage showing up, more so than just a decade before. Local fishers regularly had to rake the beach for garbage if they had any hope of keeping it, quotes, clean, in this case, meaning free of garbage. And he thought that the problem was that people threw too much away and often dumped it into the ocean instead of tossing it in a trash bin. He was hopeful that a new ban on single-use plastics in Lima would help slow the tide of plastic waste that washed up on Playa Agua Dulce every day. We go to the next slide. The fishers that I worked with and that I know in Lima are constantly navigating an increasingly changing and degraded ocean ecology. In particular, a lot of times they talk about the color of water and the importance for noticing the color of water and interpreting it as a way of looking for areas that have potential for different kinds of fish at different times of year, as well as areas that are too full of mud, of debris, or other contaminants. So they use the color of the water to kind of read and signal and interpret what's happening underneath the surface. They do what they can to fish in areas that are less polluted at different times of year to ensure that fish is safe and that there will be fish in the future. But fishers also accept that certain levels of contamination are inevitable and out of their control. Oftentimes, this attitude is mistaken by state officials and local elites as complacency. But it is a reality that these fishers live in a state of constant precarity and have limited mobility as well as limited economic options. They can't just go to where the conditions are better, as is the case for large industrial fishing boats, and also for the city's elite who have moved their summer homes from Lima to less contaminated beaches north and south of the city. As I've argued elsewhere, fishers are facing an ongoing slow process of in situ dispossession as a result of the inequalities of the Anthropocene, and also, kind of unfolding environmental injustices in Lima. Fishers' ways of caring for the wharf and the bay overlap with and are informed by state regulations and pressure from officials. Government officials, however, neither recognize this care nor provide fishers with the necessary resources to undertake large development projects on the wharf, such as rebuilding the wastewater system from the fish market, which dumps directly into the bay near the beach. State practices of monitoring water quality, like the bacteria testing, that's done on recreational beaches. And elite depictions of garbage on the area's beaches make most aspects of fishers' care invisible through the processes of translating and scaling up that officials and local elites use to translate local instances of pollution into indicators of broader environmental, governmental, and social problems. We go to the last slide. My analysis of these dynamics leads me to two primary conclusions. First, the moments in which ocean waste becomes visible, or its presence is established, are pivotal moments for uncovering how different people interpret its meaning by framing and producing it within existing languages, discourses, and practices of different but often overlapping social assemblages. The second point is that there are also critical moments in which relationships of inequality are established as actors with greater social capital assert interpretations of ocean waste that map its presence in accordance with existing social boundaries and attributions of responsibility. I say that this is a conclusion of sorts because this is, of course, an ongoing and, if you can forgive the pun, fluid situation. For example, the COVID pandemic resulted in a massive increase in Peru and around the world of single or limited use plastics, especially personal protective equipment like disposable masks, most of which were made from plastic polymers that break down into microplastics in the ocean. A lot of reusable products such as cloth shopping bags were discouraged, and in some places bans or limits on single-use items like plastic bags, disposable cups and bottles were put on hold. At the same time, the global price of oil dropped because of a rapid decline in travel and transportation, which made the production of plastics cheaper than it had been in years. And as a result, it was not long before masks started washing up on the beaches, on beaches around the world, but also in Lima. And the distribution and accumulation of COVID trash followed existing trends, with the greatest concentrations showing up on the most frequented recreational beaches in the southern portion of the bay in Lima, such as Agua Dulce and Las Sombrillas. And in keeping with the existing approaches to oceanic waste, government officials and NGO representatives in Peru urged individual Peruvians to dispose of masks and other personal protective equipment, quotes, responsibly, by not throwing them in the street or the ocean, but properly bagging them and putting them out for trash pickup. Thanks very much. I look forward to any questions that you have or points that you'd like to discuss in a little bit more detail.
Thank you, Max. That was such a fascinating talk. Really interesting to hear all the different ways that not only rubbish in the ocean, but also coming from sewage interacts with class and race and community. A really rich presentation. So thank you so much for that. And so I'll open it up then for questions from the audience. Again, I apologize if I feel like it's gone a bit louder here, but I'll very, very swiftly go on mute. If you have a question, if you want to raise your hand, and then perhaps Max, you could call out the name of that person to save me bringing the noise. Great, thank you. So Benjamin, if you'd like to unmute yourself, and also please, if you could turn on your camera when you ask a question, that would be great.
I know I've stunned everyone into silence.
I think maybe while people are thinking of their questions, I
Yeah.
could just make a comment actually.
Yeah,
So
please.
really interesting what you said about Playa Dulce. I'm not sure if you're aware, but very recently there's been a controversy here because I'm in Peru, but for those of you who don't know, there's been a controversy because they want to build a big inflatable for the summer for tourists or people to come out on the water, and the fishermen are really against it because it will obviously pollute the waters even more with everyone bringing whatever they bring to the beach, but also scare the fish away. And no one's really mentioned that also very important element of the water being contaminated by sewage and unsafe for swimming. In this whole debate, it's really got me thinking about who would actually be going there. It wouldn't be the elite who could summer further south or even abroad. This would be local poorer families who could just go down to that beach, then go on those inflatables that would also be exposed to that. So it's really interesting how this is continually cuts across all kind of events that happen around that area.
Yeah, no, I was not aware of that. I'm definitely going to have to check that out as soon as we're done talking and see what I can. No, I was not aware around that, and it is. I mean, I think it's really fascinating, and I think this is probably the kind of thing that you would see in lots of other parts of the world around kind of coastal areas where you have areas that are popular for recreation, but also have serious environmental issues as well. And it's been, as I think, as I had mentioned before, it's seen as this kind of ongoing problem area, right? It's seen as being this kind of place that like sticks out within the Costa Verde, because of course the other thing too, which I don't think I didn't have a chance to kind of talk about is you have the Playa Pescadores and Agua Dulce, which are these kinds of popular beaches. They're packed, during the summer. When you go there, there's just, shoulder to shoulder, people. And then next door is this large walled compound that is the Lima Yacht Club, right? Which is this like center of, kind of historic, privilege where, there's all these kind of beach chairs and everything kind of laid out, on the same stretch of water, but I haven't really seen very many people entering the water there. I think there are actually pools there, where people swim instead, and so you have that really kind of interesting dynamic. But yeah, I'm definitely gonna have to check that out. I wasn't aware of that, so thanks. I'm not.
Great.
I don't know that.
Sarah and Jenny have their hands up. So
Yeah.
Sarah.
Great, thanks, Rebecca, and thanks, Max. It was a really fascinating talk, and so stark, I think, some of the questions around racialization and inequalities that kind of come to the fore in what you're presenting. So I mean, a couple of things. I was really, struck by this sort of contrast between the sort of activism of the elite community and this question of care from the artisanal fisheries community. And I just wondered if there was any sense of kind of connection between the work that they're sort of differently engaged in, or is it really diametrically opposed, in the way that you sort of suggest, that there is no recognition from that sort of elite activist group around the kind of care work that those fishing communities are doing. So that was just one point. And then the other thing was just about microplastics, because I think what was so interesting about your talk was about this question of the visibility, when the points at which plastic becomes visible, and microplastics are a less visible kind of phenomena. Yeah. And I just wondered, when that microplastics become part of the narrative or the discourse, does it bring in, is there potential then to bring in a more kind of global view of kind of the circulation of plastics, or the sort of wider infrastructures that may be shaping that sort of sort of exposures?
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, those are really, I think, interesting and important questions. In terms of the first one, in the kind of overlap of activism and care, I'm not, I didn't see really any around the issue. I mean, there is some overlap in terms of the issue of plastics, in that there has been, or at least I noticed a certain amount of it's not really the right phrase, but I can't think of a better one right now, of kind of, a certain amount of buy-in, on the part of artisanal fishers in some of this, the kind of broader discourse around plastic pollution. And I think there is a certain amount of shared recognition that, that solid waste pollution is, this kind of visual blight on the beaches. And I think a certain amount of, there is a kind of overarching connection, in regards to kind of establishing that as being an issue. I think it's ultimately, though, I don't think you see that kind of those same linkages when it comes to issues of responsibility and who's responsible. There are around certain other environmental issues, I think, growing recognition, or at least partial recognition of the kinds of forms of care or at least environmental knowledge of artisanal fishing communities outside of Lima in particular. I think there's still a really kind of interesting spatial kind of dimension to this, in that the artisanal fishers active in Lima and active in Callao, I think, continue to be denigrated and looked down upon, or at least that's been my experience in kind of reading official reports, talking to government officials, talking to some people working in environmental NGOs, as being this kind of like not, I don't even know quite how to describe it, but as not being associated with the kind of more pristine, more kind of rural, more out of the city, kind of artisanal fishing communities in other parts of Peru. And I mean, you see that dynamic a little bit even within Lima, previously, like with the Port of Ancon, which was, this kind of, before there was a big oil spill there, a few years ago, was this part of Lima province that was like a resort town. And people oftentimes pointed to artisanal fishers there in contrast to the ones in Chorrillos and Callao as being, these kind of more environmentally responsible. So I think that's slowly starting to happen. There's also some interesting, this is not something I've written about, but there's also some interesting linkages that are happening with some kind of grassroots, like surfing organizations that are not from, this kind of like historically very white elite portion of the sport in the city, some of whom are, the children of, local artisanal fishers. And so there are certain linkages happening, but they're not very prominent. And I think there are a lot of, political and social barriers to that still, particularly around urban kind of artisanal fishers. In terms of the microplastics, I would say I probably, I started noticing, the kind of increased discussion about microplastics in Peru, probably about the time that, the kind of garbage, patch, was kind of highly publicized maybe 6, 7, 8 years ago. And there's been this kind of more and more discussion of the contrast between, the plastics that you see and that are, I think as you kind of indicated, are more easily, kind of racialized or kind of integrated into, these discussions about, kind of local contamination and, this kind of vast quantity of microplastics that you don't see that have kind of infiltrated the oceanic, web of life. I'm not quite sure how to think about that, just in terms of, how that I mean, it is something that people kind of talk about in local concerns, but it certainly is, as you pointed out, an issue that is, at least in my experience so far, is kind of made intelligible within this kind of broader, like, global language of, of plastic contamination. And that is, I mean, it's something that I need to probably think about a little bit more. It's a really kind of interesting contrast, right, in terms of that visibility and invisibility that is in some ways kind of parallel but quite different given the sourcing of it with bacteria, right? Because bacteria is another kind of aspect of like contamination that's not visible, that then becomes visible through this kind of, you know, testing. And I need to kind of think about that or go back a little bit more and kind of see if I've kind of dealt with that in a way that I don't remember now, in terms of that relationship between these invisible plastics and then, you know, the kind of visible moments, and why, you know, in one instance that linkage is kind of made more clearly, and then in the other, you know, with contamination that's probably more easily, you know, socialized and localized, there's a more clear, you know, connection. Sorry.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Thanks.
Last with Jenny.
Hi, thanks. That was, I hope you can hear me, sorry.
Yeah,
That was a super interesting talk. And like Sarah, you know, I found the whole discussion around inequalities really, really, really interesting. And it's very, you know, from a localized perspective, I can really see what's going on. And I just wondered if you could sort of put it within the wider context of sort of fishing, and in particularly sort of discussions around overfishing that are happening sort of more globally.
yeah.
And the impact of these contaminants on fishing. And I also wondered if you could talk about it in relation to, so particularly because you talk about the inequalities and you talk about the different classes involved in the discussions around this, you know, how much does this discussion around sort of pollution come to play on the consumption of fish, and in particular looking from, you know, the classes who are going to restaurants and buying their food in restaurants, you know, how much of an issue has that become? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really fascinating topic, and you know, there's kind of a long and interesting history that parallels, you know, some of these other discussions, at least in Peru. And my mind kind of automatically goes back to, you know, the debates in Lima around the cholera outbreak, you know, in 1991, because there was this very kind of, you know, visible politics around, you know, fish and fishing, because, you know, eating seafood was something that was, you know, initially, and particularly eating raw seafood in the form of ceviche, was something that was associated with the cholera outbreak, even though, you know, later on, you know, there was public health research, you know, that demonstrated the majority of the people who were going to, you know, hospital had not eaten contaminated seafood. And very famously, you know, the president of Peru at the time, Fujimori, who recently just passed away, you know, kind of went down to the docks and was, you know, filmed on television, like eating, you know, raw fish, while the public, you know, health minister, you know, was kind of arguing against people eating fish. And some of the kind of interesting commentary on that from the public health perspective was that, you know, that Fujimori, that the elite classes were eating, you know, these pelagic fish from, you know, far off the coast, you know, that were not contaminated in the same way that, you know, the kind of cheap fish from these near, you know, these artisanal fisheries, these kind of near coast areas, you know, these are the kind of cheap fish that you know, people in, you know, the poorer parts of the city were eating. And there is very much this kind of ongoing, I think, discussion and consideration of that. It's kind of really interesting, you know, on the docks and talking to artisanal fishers, because on the one hand, people, they acknowledge that there's a certain degree of contamination. They also can't really deal with that contamination. And so there's that kind of, you know, that kind of ongoing feeling of, yes, the contamination is there, but we keep eating the fish every day. And how bad can it be? Despite the fact that, you know, at least anecdotally, I know many artisanal fishers who have had, you know, different cancers in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, and that may be, you know, entirely anecdotal, you know, and there have been times in which, you know, I've been present for meetings with, you know, people from the, you know, the fishing ministry as well as the health ministry that have said very specifically around shellfish. There are divers, you know, that use the bay to dive for different types of shellfish, that because of the contamination levels, particularly because of the heavy metals, I think should not be consumed. You know, they should not, you know, be eaten, and yet, you know, people continue to harvest them, continue to, you know, to sell them and continue to eat them. So there's definitely, you know, this kind of ongoing discussion about that in terms of some of the kind of broader issues of contamination, like, like with mercury. I think there is, or that's been my experience. And I don't, Rebecca, I don't know if you have, kind of other insight on that, but what I've kind of, I guess, I think the most kind of salient distinction that I've noticed is that kind of near shore versus that kind of offshore, and that kind of feeling that like what is close to shore is, that artisanal fishers are catching these kinds of cheap fish from these heavily polluted waters, whereas, kind of the stuff that's coming from offshore, your kind of more pelagic species are in the open ocean. There isn't the kind of same concern around contamination, which, obviously those fish, also have, particularly the ones that are higher up in the trophic level have, often wildly high levels of contamination. I think I was listening to a podcast recently. Someone was talking about eating tuna, eating some of these large, pelagic species, and likened it to essentially eating a Superfund site because the levels of contamination were so high, which is chilling. But I don't know if that answers your question or not.
No, that's great. That's really interesting. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Were there any other questions from other audience members?
Rebecca, there is one in the Q&A actually.
Is there? Oh, sorry. Not to me. Did it come directly to you?
Yep. I can read it out, whether you can see it.
I can't.
Max, there. The question is from an anonymous participant. Would you agree that some of the contamination along Lima's coastline is irreversible? What are some solutions that are increasingly being discussed about?
Boy, I mean, I would imagine, I'm a sociocultural anthropologist. So, I feel like this is to a certain degree, the degree to which some of that contamination is reversible or irreversible is probably better answered by someone who understands biochemistry, a little bit better. I would imagine that, unfortunately, some of that contamination is, irreversible. I think we all probably kind of understand and acknowledge that, some of the contaminants, some of the toxins that have been, released into the ocean, into oceanic waters are there forever, if not for a very long time. I think, I can't remember the exact percentage, but just going back to this issue of microplastics, that, I think essentially the vast majority of the plastics that humans have ever produced are still with us, right? Recycling has been, a largely ineffective way of, dealing with plastic pollution. And it's something that really just takes, kind of plastic, contamination out of the waste stream, for a short period of time, right? So I would imagine that, some of that contamination is not reversible. I think in terms of some of the contamination that is reversible, I mean, I think, obviously, sewage is an ongoing issue in Lima, as it is in many coastal areas. And, the sewage infrastructure, I think, is always struggling to keep up. They recently have retrofitted La Chira, and there's been, construction to extend, the effluent pipe farther out into the ocean, so that at least the sewage is being, pushed farther away from the coast. But, obviously, in terms of, solutions, one of the kind of significant and important solutions, would be infrastructure investment. And that is an ongoing, discussion in terms of improving, sewage processing, so that, the effluent that's being released into the ocean has been effectively treated. I think there is, ongoing and rightfully so, attention that's being paid to particularly the rivers. And rivers are, something we didn't have a lot of time to talk about, but are a really significant, important aspect of thinking about and confronting ocean pollution, because a lot of, the plastic and a lot of the other, waste that is being, that makes its way into the oceans is actually coming, downstream from, garbage that's being dumped into rivers. That's apparent if you spend any time in kind of Lima and you go and look at, the Rimac or the Chion or the Lorin rivers. So, I think in terms of coming up with just solutions that don't, improperly assign blame or responsibility to people who have the fewest resources to deal with this, I think the important discussions that are happening are, about infrastructural improvements that can deal with the city's waste on, a large scale, basis. There was also some other bizarre ones, and again, Rebecca, I don't know if you, kind of came across this, but there were points at which they were using, vultures, to track illegal garbage dumping in Lima, and something that kind of sounded, I remember reading about this, that came out of like a science fiction, novel, something, something like that. So there've been, some also bizarre and kind of absurd, discussions and ways of, kind of approaching this. So hopefully that answers the question.
Great, thank you, Mac. I haven't heard about the vultures, but we'll agree with that. We do have another question here from Maria, who says, would you mind briefly touching on some of your major influences or authors you would suggest for further reading on the impacts of ocean waste and contamination at coastal communities?
I don't know if I caught the last part. Sorry.
Sorry. So she says, would you mind briefly touching on some of your major influences or authors you would suggest for further reading on the impacts of ocean waste and contamination of coastal communities?
Okay. Boy, ocean waste. I think for me, just in terms of thinking about waste and the circulation of it, not in relation to oceans, but Joshua Reno's work, is really great and important work within anthropology and the anthropology of waste. Trying to think about kind of ocean waste in particular, and not getting any great kind of thoughts or suggestions that come to mind. I mean, in terms of just kind of thinking about the the book more broadly, or at least this book and the work that I've been doing, I think a lot of Jason Moore's work on world ecologies and kind of thinking about the ways in which capitalism reorganizes nature and kind of puts nature to work is really critical for me, and kind of at least thinking about the book and broadly framing it and thinking about how how waste is kind of part of that, and also about kind of how inequality fits into these broader processes of kind of extracting and producing value in one place by concentrating harm and waste and responsibility in other places. Another really great book, and I'm going to forget both the title and the author's name as I'm now trying to produce it, that I've used recently with my students, is a book called Fighting to Breathe, I think, and I can probably produce the name here. Nicole Fabricant's book on environmental justice and environmental toxicity in Baltimore, is also been another book that I've really really appreciated and thought was kind of an amazing work in kind of thinking about these issues of environmental harm.
Great, thanks so much. And thank you everyone for your questions. So I think if there are no more questions, we can wrap up now. So thank you so much again for Max's presentation today. That was so fascinating. I think we can all agree with from your post. So thank you again. And before everybody finishes off, I just wanted to flag the other two seminars that are coming up in this series. On the 27th of November, we have Maria Cruz and Stephanie Rendon Medina, who will be speaking about the gendered economy of blue and protein in Mexico. And then on the 10th of December, we have Sofia Rivera Sotelo, who's going to be talking about proliferation and artisanal fishing in Colombia. So if you're interested, please do also sign up for those events. You can find that on the same website, I think, where you found the Zoom link for this. And we look forward to seeing you. Thank you, everybody. Thanks again, Max.
Yes, thank you again.
Thanks very much, Max.
Thank you.